Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada, and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to build the most prosperous place in the world. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs and to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 8, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journey. In this episode, we're joined by Kayla Isabelle, the Chief Executive Officer at Startup Canada, the gateway to Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Startup Canada's mission is to connect Canada's entrepreneurs with the tools, community, and support they need to start and build their businesses. Kayla has dedicated her career to supporting entrepreneurs both in Canada and internationally. An award-winning leader, strategic communications consultant, and change management facilitator, she's passionate about leveraging the power of storytelling in the entrepreneurial community. Kayla sits down with Scott to discuss the state of entrepreneurship in Canada.
I am so excited to have Kayla Isabelle, the CEO of Startup Canada, on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. I am so excited to be speaking with you today on both the important topic of the state of entrepreneurship in Canada, which you are so well poised to speak on, given your work with tens of thousands of entrepreneurs across the country through Startup Canada. First off, can you describe for our listeners a little bit, what is Startup Canada? What is the organization's mission? What are some of your activities?
Amazing. Absolutely. So Startup Canada is a national nonprofit, and our goal is to help entrepreneurs get connected to resources, tools, and community. And what that looks like is women-specific programs, initiatives that help entrepreneurs go global, mainly to the US. We do some advocacy initiatives as well to get the perspectives of founders to all levels of government. And then we tell the incredible stories of entrepreneurs all across the country through digital programming, things like our Startup Canada tour, but all with really the intention to help entrepreneurs understand what support organizations are out there that can help them in the infancy of their business to get things right, really in that building of a solid foundation, and help them spend less time Googling their way through that and more time actually working on their business, which is a massive undertaking. And, there's a tremendous number of support organizations in Canada, which is one of our biggest strengths, but can be very challenging to navigate through to figure out what is the best support organization for you.
And you became the CEO of Startup Canada, I believe, approximately 4 years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, correct?
Yeah, right on the pandemic, March 1st, 2020. It was a bit of a bumpy ride the first couple of months, but yeah, it's been just under 4 years now.
What was it like taking over Startup Canada at such a tumultuous time in world history?
To say that it was a challenge, I think it would be an understatement. But interestingly, I think a lot of people were actually navigating new leadership journeys around that time. The more that I talked to other leaders, it felt like actually there's a lot of movement in the beginning of 2020. So I started with some ambitious, fun, lofty in-person event goals throughout the year. We were going to be doing this whole cross-Canada tour actually in 2020. And then that quickly had to pivot online like every other organization. So the leadership journey, I learned a tremendous amount. It was exhausting. My mental health really struggled during that time, just feeling like, how are we possibly going to get out of this situation? What is tomorrow going to look like? How do we maintain our partners and sponsors and ultimately help entrepreneurs that were navigating so much uncertainty and trying to be a source of strength, right? They were coming to us to answer some of these questions. And I was like, well, I don't even know what's happening right now. And that sort of feeling of, it's not even imposter syndrome, but just not having, the confidence or the intel or, a crystal ball to say what was going to happen in the future. So it was very challenging. It was very demanding, but it was almost like a leadership MBA in a year or two that I learned so much around building programming, looking at the impact of that programming, how to do digital national programs and really connect entrepreneurs in new ways, and how to build new partnerships. That is really the foundation of Startup Canada's mission and vision. So it was, I can look back and be grateful for the experience in some ways, but man, it was a rough go for a little while.
And one of the things I heard from you is that through that experience, you had to demonstrate a lot of those entrepreneurial characteristics, such as adaptability, such as resilience in going through that challenging time, which I can imagine is helpful as you think about serving entrepreneurs across Canada as well.
100%. And that there's empathy there, right? Like I was really, learning how to build a business myself and scale the business, understand issues with talent, trying to be on top of things like supply chain and advising different founders across so many different industries. I was really in the trenches learning with many of the founders that were in our community. And now looking back on it, there are some tools that I wish I had leveraged. So it was great to see what resources are actually out there. But I definitely felt in community with many of the early stage founders we were helping.
What are some of the ways that you've evolved Startup Canada's programming over the last 3.5 years?
That I love that question. It's taken, I would almost describe it as taking all of the bricks out of an organization during the pandemic and very thoughtfully putting them back in. There was almost this COVID cover is how I describe it, of taking things that weren't working for the organization, things that were potentially, legacy programs or things that we'd done for so many years, but weren't actually demonstrating the impact that we needed them to make. This gave us a beautiful moment to say, hey, we need to do things differently. We need to really focus on what founders practically need in this moment. And that needs to take priority. So it really provided that great foundation. We did that in streamlining what our programs really were. We did so much over the first, 6-7 years of startup because entrepreneurs need so many different resources, tools, events, programs, connections. Like there's never a shortage of things to do. But by being everything to everyone, we became no one to such a large community kind of thing. So we tried to be really intentional about focusing our initiatives and looking at the entrepreneurs that needed the most support. So we were looking at women entrepreneurs. We were looking at the export potential of Canadian businesses, and that being a huge driver of potential growth, especially for equity deserving founders and underrepresented folks as well. We were looking at advocacy to say, how are things like CERB or CEBA or new programs during the pandemic, how are they actually working in this moment and creating that direct pipeline to various decision makers in government? And then telling the really challenging stories of founders in those moments. Because even for myself, I was like, am I the only one who's struggling here? Am I the only one who feels this incredible sense of overwhelm? So I think it was about shifting the programs to be really true to the moment and the experience and the lived pressures and vulnerabilities people were feeling, and trying to be really specific and more strategic in how this pathway can evolve over time. We're trying to convene all these different support organizations. There are thousands of organizations in Canada. We're not going to be able to talk to every single one of them right today. But we've been able to make lots of incremental progress to bringing all of those partners under the Startup Canada umbrella, building those relationships, and ultimately helping our founders get connected directly through them. So we've seen a lot of progress with that, especially with our Startup Canada tour, which is going across the country physically this year, and great to see those partnerships come to life.
One of the things that your organization works on is how to foster more entrepreneurship in Canada. And there's often debates around how we measure entrepreneurial activity as a country. What do you think is the most effective or most valuable way to measure entrepreneurship?
I love this question because I struggle with it as well. It's, are we looking at how do we define entrepreneurship first and foremost? Are we looking just at, startups and the lack of a common definition of what even a startup is? In the world, there's not one common definition. So who is a startup? Who is a small business owner, an SME? Obviously, we've got some criteria that different organizations use in that context. What about the side hustlers? What about those that still are working full-time jobs while they're building their business? There's not one common definition or look or experience of an entrepreneur. So measuring what that looks like as a nation and then comparing that apples to every other country in the world is near impossible. So for us, I think it's looking at those that have an idea, they want to build some type of business, either for-profit, nonprofit, charity. We work with all different types of business types, and seeing how can we get them connected to the right resource, and tracking that. That's how we are measuring the entrepreneurship community in the Startup Canada family. other organizations. There's groups like Startup Genome, there's the Global Entrepreneurship Network. There's so many other entities that try to measure and demonstrate what one city might be doing that's better than the other, or what is creating the more unicorns in a specific context. Where do we actually see small business support really ramping up? But it's been very challenging to get a full global snapshot that is apples to apples to apples, measuring entrepreneurship versus a segment or industry. We're also looking now a lot more at growth, at scaling, taking these traditional SMEs and really having them make a bigger impact to the Canadian economy. So how can they create more jobs in a specific industry or region? And that, I think, is a really interesting driver. Within the Canadian context, we're looking at newcomers coming to Canada and also really supporting that agenda. So there are so many variables that go into this holistic view of entrepreneurship. But for us, anybody who has an idea and wants to, leverage that idea to do good or make money or, sell a product or service like that, that simple line is really what we're looking at when we talk about entrepreneurs.
You also have an interesting vantage point in the sense that you have a perspective on all of the startup communities across Canada. And you can see certain startup communities that might be perhaps more vibrant than others. What do you think are the defining characteristics of the most successful startup communities?
They all have a different flavor, right? So if I even point to our Startup Canada tour, so we went to Whitehorse, Halifax, and Vancouver, 3 completely different ecosystems. And when you look in Canada, if you're thinking more traditional tech startup, you're looking at, Waterloo, Toronto kind of corridor, you're looking at Montreal, Calgary's doing some really cool movement, Vancouver as well. You're not necessarily thinking of Whitehorse to, build your first tech startup. But what they have that is the secret sauce is this powerful community, this really human-centered approach to business, and a completely different way of both starting and growing their businesses across Canada with so many different challenges: logistics, shipping, marketing that type of product or service across the country, et cetera, or even internationally. So Whitehorse, I'd say their secret sauce is their ability to really embed themselves and leverage that power of community. You see that happening in Halifax as well. Again, not a city that necessarily comes to mind when you think of the most innovative cities in Canada, but they are punching way above their weight class. And we're seeing that come to life in that movement and energy. And then in groups like Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, all these other places as well, you see a tremendous investment community that sort of scaffolds the traditional tech startups and general businesses overall. You see a lot of provincial investment or municipal investment in understanding the power of entrepreneurship. If you have those champions that are going to embed programming, really champion the growth of those initiatives, attach funding to those, you're going to see that really come from the bottom up. And then that spirit then has this like duplication effect, right? If you feel this entrepreneurial energy in your ecosystem, that makes you more inspired. It makes you feel like you can actually accomplish something lofty. You look at the Waterloo corridor in particular, you see BlackBerry, however many years ago, booming from that space. How many new businesses and startups then were prompted from staff coming from that community? Just that energy and that vision and that, wow, we can actually accomplish this in the Canadian ecosystem. That energy has so much to do with the success of many of these Canadian cities. But I guess my call to action a little bit on that is to not just think of the traditional, go-to cities. Canada is ripe with innovation in many, many of the smaller and secondary markets. And that's what makes Canada so beautiful as well. We get such regional diversity in all of these different startup communities. And that creates such a more vibrant total ecosystem versus just focusing on a particular city.
On the converse side, what do you think can be some of the pitfalls that startup communities can fall in that undermine the success of those ecosystems?
I'd say redundancy is probably the biggest challenge we're seeing, because there's never been more support, more resources, more mentorship programs, more communities of funds or investment communities, et cetera. And if you're a founder looking to start out, that's a very daunting prospect to both understand what's out there first and foremost, and then being able to actually say, oh, this is a community that aligns with my values, or this is a mentor that I think could really be helpful to me in what I think my business is going to look like. What we're seeing now is a lot of investment in entrepreneurship, I would say, but what happens in that adding more money into programming, adding more initiatives, it is only adding more complexity for that founder to then say, hey, which program is actually right for me? So I'd say coming together both nationally, provincially, and municipally to say, here are the strongest programs, here is where we've seen the most demonstrated impact, and being very clear about what that impact is. It's not necessarily just revenue or profit. It's looking at jobs, it's looking at the types of businesses that we need to foster, the leadership of those businesses, making sure we're building diverse companies, founders first as well, and saying, let's anchor in those successes, partner more effectively, and help entrepreneurs navigate through more seamlessly. I'd say that is something, especially during the pandemic, when many programs that were in person went online, that got even more complicated because you could engage in, an incubator in Vancouver if you were based in Halifax, and that opportunity was never there for you before. So as a country, I think we need to have more conversations around that efficiency, get the perspectives and the lived sort of trials and tribulations of those founders that have tried to navigate through, because all the stories I hear is like, yikes, there was a lot of that research in that beginning part, and a lot of time wasted, right? Your biggest competitive advantage as a startup or an early stage business is speed. And if you're spending all that time researching, you're not spending that valuable energy and horsepower into what should be your secret sauce as an entrepreneur. So I'd say reducing the redundancy could be the biggest pitfall that I would love to see change in the next couple of years.
How do you think entrepreneurship in Canada compares to other developed economies?
It's very competitive. And I think we don't toot our own horn enough about this. The more that I talk to international ecosystems, yes, they may have benefits like a smaller geography. If we look across the EU, if you were trying to build a business in France or in Italy, you're dealing with a completely different, even just geographic footprint to navigate through and leverage all the supports your country offers. Canada is massive, and that makes it very challenging to truly build these national entities. But when it comes to EU across Africa, I've done a lot of work with different international stakeholders, and they often look to Canada as a best practice, not only in the supports that our government makes in entrepreneurship, but the types of businesses that are coming out of Canada are world class. And we often have, yes, tall poppy syndrome. Yes, we are very modest, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need to get away from that narrative and just really put these Canadian businesses on the podium that they deserve, help them scale globally while keeping them in Canada. We don't want, all these businesses to feel like they have to go to the US because that's where they get this footprint and this, international real estate and recognition and investment. In Canada, there's often this sentiment that, we have a very risk-averse investment community, and there's lots of narrative around that. How do we make sure that our businesses are front and center Canadian, and making sure everyone in the world knows that? Because we have high quality everything else. We've got the academic institutions, we have the spirit, we have the great ideas, we have the programming, we have mentors and advisors that have successfully, scaled businesses, and an appetite to really make sure that we're getting this right. And that's missing in a lot of other international ecosystems. They don't necessarily have that leadership and that commitment to supporting founders. If that's small businesses or tech startups, I'm lumping them all into one. And they're potentially missing these great opportunities to build the really incredible businesses of the future because they're not making that investment at the beginning. But I think we're doing great in a lot of ways. Got still a lot of room to go. But the world really looks to Canada as an incredible best practice.
What are some of the best practices that exist in Canada that you think are particularly noteworthy?
I would say just the spirit of collaboration. Like, we do genuinely have a very collaborative ecosystem. Yes, there's natural competition naturally in business, but you see a community, like I think of Canada's Accelerator and Incubator Network, and this appetite for all of the accelerators and incubators across Canada to come together, share what's working, share what might not be working, and make recommendations directly to government in how they can play better together. You don't necessarily see that in other countries. It feels very competitive. There's potentially limited funding that's coming through to those programs. So they don't want to risk, potentially not accessing that funding if it goes to somebody else. In Canada, there is that base of collaboration and just a I'm trying to think of a better word than just like a human approach to entrepreneurship. Like the number of conversations that I have in the Canadian ecosystem that hold space for just the current circumstance. I'm like, how are you actually doing? How's your energy? How do you feel in this moment and in this economy and navigating all these different hurdles that we're even seeing in 2023? There, the pandemic was one massive challenge. We're in a completely different state as a country, as a global economy. And in so many conversations, we start with, how are you actually physically doing today? And talking about mental health is such an important part of that journey. Internationally, that might not be the case. You're jumping right into the P&L or you're jumping right into, something else. So I'd say the community and the camaraderie in Canada is very strong. I would also say government leadership across multiple portfolios. Like this is not just coming from, Minister Ing's portfolio or looking at international trade and development and entrepreneurship in that sense. You see health and you see, immigration, and you see all these different sort of ministerial files. Each one of them connects to entrepreneurship somehow, right? Like entrepreneurs come from so many different parts of Canada, different walks of life. They're building businesses for such different reasons. There's an intersectionality that lives and breathes in entrepreneurship that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And I think as a country, we've recognized that and the need for support holistically across that. I think of, in Yukon, they've just announced the first paid sick leave for contract employees or for entrepreneurs that live in the province or territory rather. And that's huge. Yes, maybe Europe has something better than that kind of thing. But if we look at the investment that territory is making in the lives of an entrepreneur, not just necessarily giving them $2,000 to start a website, that type of advantage is so important in making sure we have thriving humans that can actually build businesses of the future and feel that support every day, both in terms of their health, their resources, their local ecosystem and community. There's so much more than just the business that needs to be focused on when we talk about entrepreneurs.
That's awesome to hear that the government of the Yukon has created paid sick leave for entrepreneurs and self-employed folks. And it's a great idea and something that can potentially be really impactful. What are different entrepreneurial supports that you've seen outside of Canada that don't currently exist in Canada that you think should be replicated?
There's some interesting programming. I think it's coming out of Estonia, and Estonia has the highest density of unicorns coming out of it. I think as a collective, but even each year, Estonia has this magic formula for unicorns, which is wild because I think it's, less than a few million people in the entire country. It's, this tiny, tiny little space, but their government is making huge investments in helping these startups start up in a day. That's sort of this philosophy and this tool and framework that they have. It essentially helps you incorporate, understand all the different foundational building blocks, legal, marketing and sales, looking at your communication strategy, isolating that really solid business plan, and doing that in 24 hours. I think that is a really interesting model just to focus each entrepreneur in those essential enablers that often get missed. I saw that a lot during the pandemic, that many founders weren't incorporated, or they weren't looking at one major part of their business like contracts or legal, thinking they could come back to it later and it wouldn't bite them in the butt. Then, something like a seed loan or government support comes out, and one of the prerequisites is that you need to be incorporated, and many founders weren't able to access those resources. So this type of program starting up in a day is something that could change there. I would also say there's a lot of on the policy side across the EU, lots of conversations happening to help founders go to multiple countries or set up across the EU versus just in one country. And this is sort of paralleled. It's probably in terms of physical real estate, Canada's even bigger than across the entire EU. So that just to give some scale of like those two geographic footprints. But what this does is it helps these founders think bigger than just their country as a target market or in terms of talent and staff. They're thinking about way more potential across the entire EU, and there's fluidity if they want to move about. In Canada, there's not really that fluidity across different provinces and territories. And so building in some type of structure that helps Canadians leverage the full power of Canada versus having these strict rules, lots of different challenges across, different provincial governments and and the structures there, that would be really interesting for me to see. Because there's tremendous potential in having, especially with remote work, lots of different opportunities for Canadian founders to build Canadian businesses. Some good inspo from EU too.
Those are great recommendations. And that EU model is an interesting thing to replicate. We're thinking about replicating even in the context of North America as well, of potentially more ease for Canadian, American, and Mexican companies to set up additional entities within the broader kind of North American context. Is an interesting model to think about as well. So one of the other things that you talked about earlier in the interview was a challenge a lot of entrepreneurs face, is that it's challenging to just find out about all of these entrepreneurial supports that exist, because there can be at the federal level, the municipal level, the provincial level. There are hundreds or thousands of different supports that are out there for entrepreneurs. If an entrepreneur is listening to this podcast, what advice do you have for them on how to find the supports that are the best fit for them?
That's a great question. So first and foremost, just recognizing this is a hard thing. I feel like even myself, when I entered into entrepreneurship, I was like, am I missing something? Like, is there a list of every different type of support organization or every tool? And no, there really isn't. And there's new things being built every single day. So I'd say first and foremost, recognize that this is sometimes a fairly daunting task and you're not alone in feeling that. Second, there are a number of both great Canadian startups and support organizations that are trying to streamline all of these different offerings. So a couple of examples through government, that could be the Business Benefits Finder. You essentially pop in a couple of pieces of information through ISED, through almost like a Mad Libs kind of tool, and then it essentially aggregates all these various resources and tools for you that it has in its database. So there's lots of different tools like that. There's also, on the funding side, we're working with an incredible partner, Pocketed. So if you're looking for funding, obviously that's the number one challenge most founders are faced with. And when trying to Google your way into finding where funding is, there are lots of things that get lost in those cracks. So through Pocketed, you essentially enter into the platform. Again, you put in particular pieces of criteria about your business, and then they will share grant opportunities, overall funds through different levels of government, potentially some pitch competitions as well. Hockey Stick is another great example that does a similar type of aggregation. And also helps you potentially get connected with investors and identify funds that way. So those types of tools are helpful. At Startup Canada, we have what we call the Business Owner's Toolbox. So again, those foundational building blocks. What do you need to incorporate? What's the difference between a federal or provincial incorporation? What legal jargon and language do you need to understand when you're building your business? And what contracts do you actually need? How do you build a website? What type of marketing communications tools should you leverage? How do you set up your finances? What type of bookkeeping software or tools could you leverage? Those foundational blocks are all listed on Business Owner's Toolbox. It's completely free. And again, we try to link out to as many partners as possible. So by going into many of these search engines, you'll be able to then find new resources and do a deep dive in what those offerings are as well.
Pocketed is a great organization. Brianna Blaney, the CEO of that organization, is on the Venture for Canada Employer Advisory Council. And there's actually 2 VFC former employees that work at Pocketed now. So they're an amazing group with lots of ties to VFC as well.
And they're growing like crazy. Like and I think it just shows the demand for this type of support, right? And I love seeing startups solve a problem that they felt when they were starting their business, right? It's such a beautiful storyline to see that practical support come out of their initiatives.
Yeah, completely agree. It was very funny. I actually saw this morning on LinkedIn. There was a former VFC employee who left maybe 3 or 4 years ago, who I saw, she just announced like today, I'm joining Pocketed. So that's when you brought it up. I was like, that is like very coincidental.
That's cool.
Yeah, they're doing amazing work. And they've also hired a lot of interns through VFC over the years as well. So speaking of interns and talent, one of the things Venture for Canada works on is how to address the talent needs of small businesses and startups across the country. What do you view, Kayla, some of the greatest talent challenges facing startups and small businesses across the country?
This has come up in pretty much every conversation I feel like I've had with, various boards, different stakeholders, even at the local level. I sit on the Ottawa Board of Trade, and finding talent that could even come and live in the city that you reside in. everybody is talking about talent. And what I've found so interesting, even just in my journey as CEO of startup, we've been in completely different talent markets in every year of the last 3-4 years, pandemic, out of pandemic, now, in this current 2023 world. And in terms of being competitive with talent, that's something naturally within the startup space that's always going to be part of the conversation. You're looking for top talent. You need to make sure that you are, bringing in the best and brightest to ultimately support the scale of your venture. That's always been, something that's on the table. But seeing the evolution of the uncertainty in 2020, then hire and grow at all costs in 2021, 2022, then pull back and become very, very efficient with your cash, potentially reducing your staff in 2022, 2023. And now we're in this really interesting moment with, quiet quitting kind of behind us, but still, in the conversations that we have generally. And there's a bit of like whiplash is how I would almost describe it. And like, okay, what do we actually need to focus on when it comes to talent? Is it ensuring that we have more diversity in our teams as a core priority? Like, I feel like that often gets put into the later priorities when we're looking at access to talent. Yes, we need great, visionaries and leaders to join our teams, but we have not solved having really incredible diverse teams, and especially at the leadership level. So on the talent side, that to me should be much more of an embedded piece of that conversation. And looking at the pipeline of talent, getting them ready in terms of skill set, experience, understanding of tools like ChatGPT or understanding AI, or like all of these things that we're finding it complicated to work through in real time. How can we leverage really incredible students that are learning about all of these different things in real time in their education to then bring them into organizations and help them better understand how to leverage those tools? So I think on the education side, there's a huge opportunity on the talent piece. But we're always going to be talking about talent. And especially in Canada, we're constantly competing with the Silicon Valley or, US counterpart that might be able to pay more in USD and have a very different, package of experience. That's not going to change, I don't think, anytime soon. But if we are focusing on building a much stronger pipeline of staff that could be coming into startups and trained in Canadian companies and then hopefully start businesses on their own, that would be one element in addition to the diversity side. I feel like I've like gone all around on the talent question, but like, yeah, it's talent. It's a complicated thing. And you're not going to always get it right? Like, I think people think there's like this magic formula, like, oh, if we do this, we're going to solve this quote talent problem. Like, no, it needs to constantly evolve to the circumstance of the day, right? And we need to look differently at even how we like support people in, with housing prices that are increasing. Sorry, I feel like I'm like spiraling into this whole, like, people are struggling, like not employees, but people are struggling. And we need to be focusing a little bit maybe more on that, and then focusing on how we create, organizations that can support that development.
Yeah, and it relates to I think we have broader questions, which is the affordability crisis, the importance of fostering a country that is highly livable and ultimately affordable, and ultimately that is also something that contributes to economic prosperity for all Canadians. Shifting gears a little bit to another area that a lot of small businesses have challenges with, which is access to financing. Do you feel that Canadian small businesses and startups have adequate access to capital?
Oof, that's a big question, Scott. I think there is money out there. There's definitely so much untapped funding that founders are not accessing because they don't know it exists. Pocket is a beautiful solve for that in providing that information. Obviously, there's still a process there to apply, fit the criteria, et cetera. So I would say there's untapped funding for sure. In terms of investment, we're seeing, a lot of movement in that space overall, that from a VC, angel perspective, et cetera, There still is money flowing across Canada. There are large investments still being made. We're seeing startups and different seed or stage rounds still getting quite a bit of funding. It's potentially less than what we would have seen last year, but there are still some success stories there. So I don't think it's we're dried up from a funding standpoint. What I think founders need to shift in terms of mindset is not thinking that there's going to be one funding solution that's going to start their business and propel them into what they think their business should be. No business really is successful in leveraging that model. And I love this scrappier approach that people are really thinking about their cash and their revenue and sales now versus saying, oh, we're going to get this injection of cash that then is going to solve our problems or help us hire the staff that we need. So I think in terms of being confident around this landscape, that information is power, and even getting a better understanding if your venture is one that could be invested in by a VC or an angel. We see so many very traditional small businesses that are not the right type of high growth portfolio or sort of type of entity going after VCs, going after angels, and you're wasting your time, right? So I think on the funding side, understanding the right funding pathway for you and your business in alignment with your business plan, that's where energy should be focused. Then figuring out, what would that scale look like? What type of additional capital might you need to get to that next step? But there's so many resources through traditional financial institutions, banks, loans, looking at different types of capital, looking at grants, non-refundable, or non-repayable funds rather. Pocketed, again, has great inventory of those types of supports to maybe hire talent, leverage it for training opportunities. And during the pandemic, there were a number of, wage subsidies, those types of things as well that could be leveraged. One area that continues to be a huge area of frustration. I think in our census, about 70% of founders said that one of their biggest challenges was understanding government funding. Not just in where is it and how do I find it, but how do I ensure I'm successful in getting it? And if I'm not, why am I not successful in getting government funding? And this is something we continue talking to mainly federal and provincial governments about, because that frustration is deeply felt. And in moments where, there are new programs or new investments coming from the government of Canada, but entrepreneurs can't leverage it, that breeds even more frustration, right? You see it in front of you, it's dangled like this carrot, and you don't know why why you're not being successful. We've been having a lot of conversations on tour as well, because there's a lot of regional elements into that. There's potentially a much shorter timeline in Whitehorse if you're trying to leverage government funds to the Yukon than there would be in Vancouver or, Halifax, those three stops that we've been to so far. So the government piece, I think, definitely has to change. It has to be easier application processes, a more respectful timeline as well to get back to founders sooner, and potentially different criteria as to how we are going to measure success, because that flexibility, yes, we need to demonstrate the impact of that fund, but we need to leverage some of these new models in, social finance or so many of these other spaces that is not just measuring a couple of key indicators across the board, because that I think is impacting an entrepreneur's ability to leverage those funds successfully.
We've spoken today a lot about the state of entrepreneurship in Canada, but one lingering question I have is, why does entrepreneurship matter? Why is it important for the future of this country?
Entrepreneurship empowers everyone, Scott. that's the tagline. And just think about it. If you close your eyes and you think of, the coffee shop down the street, or, small business that you just bought a pair of earrings from, or, your uncle who has built this incredible software company, or your aunt, to bring some more gender parity into my examples, to find, incredible other entrepreneurs in your network, you are connected to more entrepreneurs than you think. That was actually one of the biggest ahas when I first started Canada. I was like, oh my gosh, my dad's an entrepreneur. Oh my gosh, all these people around me in my life have started these businesses. And that energy, the creativity, the accountability, and the potential of building businesses that solve real world problems, that is what the world needs right now. We can't just be thinking of the safe bets And going into these traditional career pathways that might ultimately not solve some of the world's most pressing issues. We don't have time to do that anymore. We need to be solving the climate crisis. We need to be having concrete conversations around what products, what services, what tools are going to make an impact in all of these, sustainable development goals and all of these really mission critical priorities. And entrepreneurs are the ones who are going to think very creatively around those solutions. So making sure we're supporting that energy, supporting youth who are clearly prioritizing this in the types of ventures that they're starting, and ultimately making businesses that are doing good in so many other ways and much more triple bottom line kind of approaches. And it's non-negotiable, I think, in this day and age, and to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the future, not just our kids, but even in our lifetimes. There's so much damage being caused that I think startups and entrepreneurs are the ones that are actually going to help us turn that around a little bit.
As Ashoka, the global entrepreneurship organization, says, everyone a change maker. And I think it's important that everyone is entrepreneurial, because to your point, the world needs more entrepreneurial people who go out and make things happen. One thing we're also a big fan of at Venture for Canada are books. What are a few books that you recommend that entrepreneurs read?
Okay, so right now we've got Radical Candor. That's one of my personal favorites in terms of building a team, having honest conversations, and really supporting those tough moments, like to feel more equipped with some tools. Radical Candor by Kim Scott, highly recommend. I was recommended Range by David Epstein as well. I'm mid through that. And that's talking about being more of a generalist in this world and the secret sauce there. And then, Blink is a go-to for me. How to Sell, To Sell is Human by Daniel Pink. And Option B as well by Sheryl Sandberg. I reread this once a year. It's not necessarily quite a business book, but it's about grief. And often our plan A's don't work, but there's often a really suitable plan B in our lives. And I think that spirit in entrepreneurship is so important that even, you might have a plan A business that has to shift completely or turn or morph or close down. But this openness to evolve and be constantly not wedded and gripping onto one particular thing in our lives. I think that's something we need to get better at as a collective, just to be a bit more fluid and go through life with a bit more ease. So Option B by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant would be another one.
Those are great recommendations. And lifelong learning is an essential entrepreneurial skill, and that includes regularly reading. To close things off, Kayla, do you have any final piece of advice or wise words for Canadian entrepreneurs?
The one that comes back to me all the time is, I have two. One, you can be anything, but you can't be everything. That's been a key lesson for me. In focusing a bit more on quality and less quantity in business, in life, etc. And for founders in particular, don't light yourself on fire to keep other people warm. That, I think, from a leadership standpoint during the pandemic, and just putting your mental health first, you got to put on that oxygen mask before anybody else around you can benefit from your health. And as a founder, you are constantly going to be feeling like you're lighting yourself on fire sometimes. It's exhausting. You're constantly, bruising yourself with, negative self-talk and frustration and anxiety. But at the end of the day, you need to put yourself and your mental health first, to be able to support your team, support the people around you, your loved ones, your friends. And that lesson, hopefully you don't have to learn the hard way by, really making sure you have the tools in your toolbox to support that before, you go down a burnt out type of path that many of us have navigated through. So yeah, you can do anything, but not everything. And don't light yourself on fire to keep other people warm.
I love that. You can do anything, but you can't be everything. I think I've never actually heard that before, but I think it's something that's so wise, and it's an important, and also I think for a lot of people who can be people pleasers, to recognize that you can't make people happy all the time as a leader and entrepreneur. Kayla, I love your energy and enthusiasm. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over the last couple of months, separate from this interview as well. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Scott. This has been fabulous.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture for Canada, or email us at podcast@ventureforcanada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful.